I had been on the job for 19 years when I got the call about the missing hiker on the Ridge Trail, and I still remember how ordinary it sounded at first. The guy had checked in at the backcountry kiosk right before sunset with a valid permit and a cheap headlamp clipped to his pack, and he had waved at me like any other solo camper who thought he knew what he was doing. I was finishing up the evening log at the station when the radio crackled, and it was him, reporting that his light had died halfway up the switchbacks and asking if someone could bring him a spare because the trail down in full dark was no joke. I told him the new policy was clear. No artificial lights after full dark for any reason, and he laughed a little like I was kidding, said he was already committed now and wasn't about to sit there freezing until morning. I hesitated because I had seen the memo come down from regional just 2 weeks earlier, and I figured it was one of those temporary overreactions that would get walked back after a season. Still, I grabbed one of the old mag lights anyway, and I told him I would meet him at the trailhead in 20 minutes. The walk up there without turning on my own light felt wrong from the first step. I knew every twist in that path from years of routine patrols, but at night it all felt off, like the ground was tilting just enough to throw off my balance, and I kept one hand on the grip of my service pistol out of pure habit. I reached the trailhead, and I clicked the flashlight on low because I told myself one quick sweep would be enough to spot him and hand off the spare without breaking the rules too badly. The beam cut through the dark and landed right on his pack, sitting upright on the gravel edge, but the guy himself was nowhere in sight. I called out his name from the permit, and I got nothing back except my own voice echoing off the trees. I swept the light again, and there were his boots, still laced up, standing there like he had stepped out of them mid-stride, and his phone lay next to them with the screen still glowing, showing the last text he had tried to send, which just read, "Lights out here are weird." I stood there for what felt like a long minute trying to make sense of it because there were no drag marks, no broken branches, no blood, no sign of any struggle at all. I turned the flashlight off fast, and I backed down the trail the way I had come because suddenly I did not want to be the only thing putting out any glow on that ridge. I reported it as soon as I got back to the station, and the dispatcher took the details without much reaction. She logged it as a voluntary departure until we knew more, and she said a search team would head out at first light. I argued because I had seen the boots and the phone, and none of that looked voluntary to me, but she just repeated the line, and then the line went dead. The next morning, the search team came through, and they found the site exactly as I had described it, except now there was a note pinned to the pack saying the hiker had decided to hike out early. I knew that note had not been there when I was up there because I had checked every inch of that gravel pad, and I asked the team lead about it, but he just shrugged and said sometimes people change their minds, and I should not read too much into it. I let it drop because I had been around long enough to know when pushing would get me labeled as the guy who causes problems, but I kept thinking about it for the rest of my shift. That was the first one, but it was not the last, and over the next few weeks, the reports started piling up in the same pattern. A couple with a toddler who had reserved the lower loop site checked in at sunset, and their car stayed in the lot the next morning, but the tent was empty. I and the stove was still warm, as if they had just stepped away for a minute. I went out there myself the following night because the new memo required all overnight staff to stay on site after dark, and I was the only one left who would still draw the short straw for those shifts. I walked the perimeter of the empty sites without a light, keeping my steps slow so I could hear anything that moved, and the air felt thicker the farther I got from the station lights. I found the couple's site, and everything was still set up neatly except for 3 sets of footprints leading straight into the brush, stopping as if the people had dissolved into the trees. I did not touch anything. I backed away, and I sat in the station until sunrise, trying not to think about how quiet it had been out there, with no crickets or owls or anything moving at all. A few days after that, I was sent to check on another report of an unauthorized camp that had sprung up near the old fire road. I drove out there in the late afternoon, and I could see the glow of their fire from a long way off, even though the sun had not fully set yet. When I got closer, I saw 3 tents and a bunch of college-age kids sitting around with bright lanterns and phone flashlights pointed in every direction. I approached them without my own light on and told them about the new rules. They needed to put everything out immediately and move closer to the developed area or leave the park. They argued with me for a while, saying it was bullshit and that they had been coming here for years without issues. I stood my ground, and eventually they started packing up, but one of them kept his headlamp on the whole time, and I felt my stomach turn every time the beam swept across the trees. I stayed until they drove off, but I could not shake the feeling that something had been watching us the entire time from just beyond the tree line. I reported the incident, and the next morning, when I drove back past the spot, the ground looked strangely disturbed, like something heavy had moved through the area after they left. But there was no trash or obvious damage, just that uneasy feeling that lingered. The protocols kept tightening after that, and I noticed the change in the daily briefings first. They started sending us updated radio codes that included a new priority level for any report involving artificial light after dark, and they told us we were no longer authorized to respond directly. We had to call a regional number instead and wait for instructions. And I called it the first time a camper ignored the no light sign and set up a lantern at one of the pullouts. The voice on the other end was calm and flat, and it asked me for the exact coordinates and the color of the light I had seen, and then it told me to stay inside the station and log the incident as resolved at dawn. I watched from the window as 2 unmarked SUVs rolled in 2 hours later, and the men who got out moved like they had done this before. They did not speak to me. They went up to the pullout, came back down with the lantern and the camper's gear packed into black bags, and then they drove off without filing any paperwork, as I could see. The camper himself was never mentioned again in the logs, and I started losing sleep after that because I kept replaying the sound of my own footsteps on that empty ridge and how the dark had felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with animals. I asked the station manager about it during our next shift overlap, and he looked at me for a long time before he said the regional office had data from other parks showing that light use correlated with higher rates of unexplained departures. He said it was probably just disoriented hikers making bad choices, but the way his eyes did not quite meet mine told me he did not believe that any more than I did. A week later, he put in for a transfer to a desk job in the city, and he was gone before the paperwork even cleared. The new guy who replaced him was younger, and he walked around with a permanent tension in his shoulders like he was waiting for the next call to come in. He updated the visitor signs himself, and he made sure every single one of them now included the line about leaving flashlights at home, and I watched him do it with this tight expression that made me wonder how much he already knew. Then, one afternoon, I came in early for my shift and found him in the back office, staring at the trail camera footage from the previous night. He had the volume turned up, and he was leaning so close to the monitor that his face was almost touching the screen. Suddenly, he jerked back and started muttering under his breath, and then he slammed his fist on the desk hard enough that I heard it from the hallway. When I knocked and asked if everything was okay, he told me to get out and lock the door behind me. Later that night, I heard him on the phone with someone, yelling that the data was wrong, that they had promised the area was clean, and that he was not equipped to handle this level of exposure. His voice cracked toward the end, and I heard him say something about needing a full containment team out here before it spread any further. I drew the overnight shift again last week, and that is when it got inside my head for good. I had the radio turned low and was sitting in the dark, as the memo required, because they had decided even the station's interior lights could leak out and cause issues. I kept checking the perimeter cameras, but all they showed was empty gravel and the faint glow of the security floods reflecting off nothing. Around 2:30, I heard a soft rustle near the back fence line, and I told myself it was probably a raccoon, but I still walked over to the window to look. I saw the shape of a person standing just beyond the light's reach, and I knew it was not a raccoon because it was too tall and standing perfectly still. I almost reached for my flashlight out of reflex, but I stopped myself because the new orders were burned into my brain by then. I picked up the radio instead, called the regional number, and described what I was seeing in a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. The voice on the line asked if I had used any artificial light, and when I said no, it told me to stay exactly where I was and that a compliance team would handle it. I waited in the dark for what felt like hours, and I listened to the silence stretch out until even the crickets gave up. When the SUVs finally arrived, the men moved through the trees without lights of their own, and they swept the area, and then they left again without a word to me. The shape was gone by then, but I could still feel it watching from somewhere just out of sight. 2 nights later, the new manager drew the overnight straw, and I could tell he was dreading it from the way he kept checking and rechecking all the locks before I left for the day. I went home, but I could not sleep, so I sat in my truck in the employee lot with my phone in my hand just in case. Around 3:15, my phone rang, and it was him, and his voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand the words at first. He said he had seen movement at the edge of the floodlights and that he had made the mistake of using his tactical flashlight to get a better look because he thought it was a bear or maybe a lost hiker. He kept repeating that they were attracted to the light and that he should have known better and that I needed to get over there right now with every gun I could carry. I told him to stay inside and call the regional number, but I heard him rack around in his shotgun, and then there was the sound of glass breaking somewhere in the station. Then the gunshots started, 3 quick ones followed by a longer burst, and then his voice screaming into the phone about how there were more of them than he thought, and that the light had brought them right up to the building. I was already starting my truck when the line went dead after a final loud scuffle and what sounded like the phone hitting the floor. I called the regional number while I was driving, and the voice on the other end was the same calm, flat one as always. I told them what I had heard, and they said backup was already en route and that I was to turn around immediately and not approach the station under any circumstances. I pulled over on the side of the access road, and I waited there in the dark until I saw the convoy of black vehicles fly past me heading toward the station. They were in and out in under 40 minutes. When I was finally allowed back the next morning, the station had been cleaned up so thoroughly that it looked like nothing had happened, except the new manager was gone. There was a fresh memo on the desk saying he had requested an immediate transfer for personal reasons. The next morning, the new manager pulled me into the office, and he told me the park was cutting back on overnight staffing, effective immediately, and that I would be reassigned to a day shift only until further notice. He did not explain why, and I did not ask because I already knew the pattern. I have seen 3 other rangers quietly move out in the last month, and each time the official reason is something boring like budget adjustments or personal leave. I finished my last required overnight 2 nights ago, and I spent the whole time sitting in the station, my hands clenched around the radio and my eyes fixed on the dark beyond the floods. I never turned on a light, and nothing came close enough for me to see it clearly, but I felt the weight of it all the same. I have been transferred to another park starting next month, and I already know the rules there will be the same as at my current park. I will follow them because I have seen what happens when you do not. I do not know what is out there in the dark between the trees, but I know it notices when you light up the night, and I know it waits until you are the only thing moving. I have spent 19 years keeping people safe in these parks, and right now, the safest thing I can do is tell you this straight. When you head out into the backcountry after the sun goes down, you leave the flashlights in the car. You stay in the dark, you stay quiet, and you do not test the rules because the rules are there for a reason, even if no one will say it out loud. I am tired, and I am scared in a way I cannot explain to anyone who has not stood on that ridge at night, but I am writing this because I still believe most people want to get home safe. So do what they tell you. Leave the lights at home. I was already deep into my backcountry patrol on that old dirt road when I saw her standing there off to the side in the middle of a rock-studded field on the slope to my left, and I slammed on the brakes hard because something about the way she was standing there, about the fact that she had absolutely nothing on her back, no backpack, no canteen, no nothing, struck a wrong note right off. I rolled down my window and hailed her, asking if she was okay, since people get lost in this wilderness all the time and end up catatonic from exposure. But she did not even turn her head, simply began walking away from me, marching straight up that rocky incline as if I was not even there. I sat there for a second, watching her disappear into the distance, then thought about that missing persons case I had glanced at that morning back at the station, about that woman who had vanished 8 months before on a solo day hike. And I grabbed my laptop from the passenger seat and booted it up fast, since the face in that photo that I pulled up was identical to the one disappearing into the distance, except for the clothing, of course, and for the fact that she looked too clean, too well put together for someone who had been out in this wilderness for that long in this kind of terrain that chewed up experienced hikers and spat out their bones. I called it in right away, my voice sounding much calmer than I was as I told them what I had witnessed. They told me to hold my position while they checked the logs, but I was not in any position to just sit there, so I grabbed my backpack and took off on foot, running up this slope toward the tree line because, if she was to continue at the rate she was going, I knew I still had a chance to catch up to her before she got too far into the thick stuff. The climb was much steeper than it had appeared to be from the road, my boots slipping on the loose rocks a few times, but I was determined to continue on because I could still see her silhouette in front of me, weaving in and out of the boulders, so I called her name from the report, hoping to stop her in her tracks, but she never slowed down. Instead, she just continued on until she slipped over the top of the rise and disappeared into the trees. I made my way to the top, breathing heavily, until I saw her tracks, fresh prints in the dirt, leading directly into the woods, and I followed them without hesitation, because the alternative was to go back to the truck and pretend as if I had not witnessed what I had witnessed. I climbed the last bit of loose scree, my hands scraping on sharp edges as I hauled myself over the ridgeline, and I kept my eyes fixed on the faint impressions her shoes made in the shifting ground, because it was shifting under my feet with every step, and I had to position my feet just right to keep from sliding back down the way I came. The air became cooler the further I ascended, and I could feel my shirt stuck to my back because of my sweat, but I did not stop to adjust anything. I merely kept moving because I could hear my pulse beating in my ears, and I knew I was closing the gap even though I had not seen her again. I went through a thicket of branches that scratched my face and arms because they were so low, and I kept calling her name every 10 yards or so because it made it all more real and not like I was chasing a ghost in the middle of nowhere. The forest closed in quickly around me with branches scraping against my jacket and underbrush snatching at my legs, but I stayed on her trail for what felt like an hour, maybe longer, going deeper into the woods than I had any right to venture on my own follow-up search, and all the time I expected to catch sight of her just ahead, just around the next cluster of pine trees, because I was going faster than she had gone. I called her name again, and my voice echoed back at me, flat and dead, as though the woods were absorbing it before it could travel very far. That was when my first real sense of unease began to seep in, because the air seemed thick and heavy, and all the normal sounds of birds and whatnot had died away until it was just my breathing and my footsteps on the needles. I knew I'd lost her trail when they just stopped in a small clearing, as though she'd stepped off the earth itself. I circled the area twice, pushing through underbrush and snapping branches, but there was nothing. No sign she'd gone any further, no sign she'd gone at all. I stood there for a long minute trying to get my bearings, and that was when I saw it through a gap in the overgrowth, a straight, clean staircase rising up out of nowhere in the middle of the forest, like someone had just dropped it there from another world. I muttered to myself, asking what the hell something like that was doing out here, as the steps looked new, the woods smooth and pale without a single sign of moss or weathering, and the whole structure just sitting there perfectly level against the uneven ground like it had been built yesterday. I took a few steps closer, even though every instinct was telling me to turn around and go back the way I came. But the closer I got, the more I felt like I was under the gaze of everything around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold prickle ran down my arms like something was studying me in the shadows between the trees, and I was telling myself it was just exhaustion, or the isolation playing games with my mind, but the feeling just kept growing until I could not ignore it anymore, and I started to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the staircase, because I could not shake the feeling that it was waiting for something or someone, and that maybe it had been waiting for her too. I turned to begin making my way back in the direction from whence I came, but the light had clearly changed without my realizing it, for the afternoon sun, which should have still been high in the sky, was now dipping low in the horizon, and the woods were darker than they had any right to be in the afternoon. I looked at my watch again, and it was now dead. My cell phone screen remained black no matter how many times I tried to turn it back on. I began to hurry my pace, then ran through the underbrush with my heart racing because the silence had grown thick and heavy, and I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, tall shapes that ducked behind trees and in the undergrowth, but every time I turned my head quickly to catch a glimpse of them, they were gone, just trees and darkness. I ran back in the direction of the slope where I had left my truck in a panic, telling myself I could reach it before nightfall, but the ground dropped off sharply in places, and in my haste, I misjudged the edge in the dim light, tumbling hard over the rocky drop, my elbows and knees crashing into boulders as I rolled and slid down into the darkness, rocks falling around me in an avalanche effect that stole my breath. I landed in a heap at the bottom, face down in the dirt, and my last memory is the taste of blood in my mouth and darkness closing in around my field of vision. When I came to, there was another ranger standing over me, shining a light in my face and asking if I was okay. I blinked up at him because his face did not look familiar at all, and I tried to sit up, but my head spun so bad that I had to lie back down. He kept staring at me with this weird expression on his face and asked me my name like he already knew it half of the time. When I told him my name, though, his jaw dropped and he said it couldn't be because everyone had thought I was dead and had been for the past 8 months. I laughed at first because it sounded so ridiculous, but then I looked around and the trees were different and the leaves were brighter and greener, like they would be in early summer instead of late spring, like they had been when I had started out that day. My truck was nowhere in sight down the road either. I asked him the date and he told me and shook my head saying he had to be messing with me because I had only been out there a few hours chasing that woman, but he just looked at me with a pitiful expression and said no one had seen any woman and no one had seen me either, not since the day I had disappeared 8 months ago. He called for help, and they got me to the hospital, where the doctors kept saying that I must have hit my head and that it was all a hallucination from the exposure. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew the staircase was real, and the way the woods had sucked in and held on to me until time itself had bent around me. The other rangers came by the hospital room later, and they told me the search parties had covered the area for weeks after I went missing, and they never found any staircase or any sign of the woman, and the official report listed me as a voluntary departure or maybe a hiking accident that I had somehow survived on my own. But I listened to them without arguing because I could see in their faces that they thought I had cracked out there, but I kept thinking about the climb and the tracks and the impossible steps and the feeling of being watched the whole time, and I knew none of it had been in my head. They discharged me after a few days with the usual warnings about not returning right away, but I have already requested my old route back because the pull is still there in the back of my mind, like the forest is waiting for me to finish what I started. I have spent 19 years in these parks keeping people safe and telling people what to watch out for, but right now the safest thing I can do is get this down because I need someone to understand that some things out here do not follow any rules we know, and they do not let go once they have their hooks in you. I am returning as soon as they say it is okay because I have to see it again and I have to find out what happened to her and what the woods took from me in the missing months. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I went through, and I know the staircase is still waiting for people out there in the trees, pulling people off the trails one by one. So if you ever find yourself driving through the backcountry and you see a person walking away from you with no gear and a face that you swear you've seen in the missing persons reports, just keep driving and don't follow them because some paths only lead further in, and some things only allow you to go as long as they're done with you. I am tired, and my head still hurts from the fall, but I am writing this because I need it out of me before I go back in, and I still believe most people just want to go home, but the woods have other ideas about that. The experience of running down that slope stuck with me even when they were fixing me up in the hospital because it seemed like the rocks were giving way beneath me because I'd seen enough and needed to be sent back out. I recalled how I'd twisted my ankle on a route about halfway down this sprint and how I'd continued running, limping even harder with every step, because to stop would be to allow whatever was back there to close that distance between us for good. The shapes had been growing bolder as I ran. I'd been catching glimpses of them now, tall and thin, moving between the trees in that same crouched position that made them look like part of the trees until they'd straighten up and I'd see the long length of their arms brushing against the branches without so much as snapping a twig. I never looked back more than once or twice because every time I did, my panic rose up my throat again, and I strained my legs even harder despite my lungs burning and my vision tunneling. I burst through one last wall of brush, and suddenly the slope fell away steeply in front of me, and I tried to stop running, but my momentum took me right over the edge and down again, my arms flailing as I tried to grasp something solid and failing as I hit rocks that bruised my sides and my backpack ripped open and spilled out gear that I would never see again. The fall seemed to take longer than it should have, like the hill had stretched itself out, especially for me. I hit the ground with a jolt that took my breath and left me staring up at the darkening canopy of leaves and wondered if this was how the woman had felt when the woods took her. They kept me in the hospital longer than I wanted to stay because of the scans that showed a mild concussion, and that time loss was probably from that. But I knew that wasn't true because I had been wide awake the entire time that I was out there, and the only things that had changed were the season and the calendar, and the look that the other rangers gave me like I was a ghost that they had already buried. I spent those days in that bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about every step of that follow, and the more that I thought about it, the more that I remembered little details that I hadn't even noticed at the time, like how the staircase had no railing, and how the steps just seemed to go down into the ground as far as I could see, and how the air around it had seemed warmer than the rest of the forest, like something was breathing from below. I attempted to tell the doctors about the tall figures and how I had observed them watching me without making a movement, but they would nod their head, make some notes, increase my dosage so I would not talk any more about it, and I learned to remain quiet after that because I needed to get out and get back to the road where I had left the truck. The new ranger, who had found me, came by my bed frequently, sat in the chair next to my bed, and asked me questions about what I could recall, and I could tell he was trying to figure out if I was crazy or if something real had happened. But I told him the truth every time because I thought if anybody could believe me, it was another guy who spent his days driving the same empty roads. I got cleared for light duty eventually and was sent to work at the main station doing desk duty. But they told me the backcountry was too much for me at the moment. But I kept asking for my old route and kept checking the missing persons database every shift to see if a new name had come in that followed the pattern of people who went out for a quick hike and never came back. The pull was with me every night. And every night I closed my eyes, I saw the staircase again and felt the eyes on me, and I woke up in a sweat with my hands clenched like I was still gripping the wheel of the truck. I started driving out to the trailhead on my days off, even though I wasn't supposed to, just so I could stand there and look up the slope and convince myself that it was real and that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. The woods looked ordinary in the daytime, just a lot of rocks and trees and the usual mess of pine needles on the ground. But I knew better now, and I knew that if I walked up there again, the staircase would be waiting for me and the shapes would be watching, and maybe I wouldn't come back down the way I had before. I have been in these parks for 19 years, keeping people safe, telling people what to watch out for, and I know that right now, the safest thing I can do is get this down on paper so that someone will understand that some of these things out in these woods do not follow any of the rules that we know, and they do not let go once they have their hooks in you. I am going back in as soon as I am cleared to do so, because I have to see it again, and I have to find out what happened to her, and I have to find out what the woods took from me in those missing months. I know that no one is ever going to believe me, but I know what I went through, and I know that that staircase is still out there in those woods, pulling people off of those trails one by one. If you ever find yourself in those backcountry woods and you see someone walking away from you, no gear, no nothing, and a face that you could swear you saw in those missing person reports, then for your own good, keep driving, do not follow, because some of those paths only lead deeper, and some of those things only let you go when they are done with you. I am tired, my head is hurting from that fall, but I am getting this down on paper so that I can get it out of me before I go back in. And I know that most people out there just want to make it home. But the woods have their own ideas about that. I was halfway through my afternoon circuit on the outer trails when my radio suddenly crackled with a call from the station, telling me to come back in early. A woman at the front desk was inquiring about her missing brother, and they wanted me to look at the missing persons flyer because I'd been working the backcountry all week. I acknowledged the call and headed back to the station in my truck, taking the winding service road. It was a short drive, and I thought it would be another run-of-the-mill call, like the ones we got every few months when someone got worried that someone else had wandered off one of the designated paths. The sun was high enough in the sky to cast long shadows on the pavement. I opened my windows to let in some cool autumn air as I drove past the deserted picnic areas and the serene ponds where a few ducks swam lazily. I kept one hand on the wheel and one hand on my seat because it wasn't an urgent call, but something in the way it was given prompted me to pay closer attention to the usual places along my route. Old fire pits and trees where people sometimes tried to set up unauthorized camps. The drive back was taking longer than it should have, considering the road was clear, but I was taking in everything along the way, looking for anything out of place in the tree line. There was something in my gut, something nagging me, like the park was hiding something I'd overlooked earlier in my route when I drove by without paying much attention. A few minutes later, I pulled into the station parking lot and saw the gray sedan parked up front, right next to the official trucks and carts. It stood out among the other parked vehicles with mud splatters and decals. I took my spot right next to the sedan and went in. Inside the station, the air is always the same temperature no matter what's happening outside. I found Emmett in the front room with a woman about our age, named Lena, with curly brown hair and hazel eyes that looked like she'd been through a lot. They stood up when they saw me come in. Emmett introduced her. She had a firm but tired handshake. I sat down across from her, and she began telling me that her brother Sam had the habit of drifting from place to place without any notice. A few days had turned into weeks, and the investigation had gone cold except for people who mentioned that he had talked about a camping trip in an old RV he had fixed up. I nodded, familiar with such stories, and she went on to tell me about Sam while handing me the poster with the bold red writing of missing and the picture of a blonde guy with hazel eyes who could be any guy on any weekend getaway. She went on for a while, her voice steady but with cracks here and there, about how Sam would text her from wherever he ended up and then go silent for long stretches of time. This had not been a problem before, but now it sounded like signs she had not taken seriously. I kept my eyes on the poster and tried to visualize the guy on any of the trails I had walked that morning, but there was nothing familiar. I took a moment to look at the picture and tell her that I had not seen him on my routes, but that did not necessarily mean he had not come through. The place is big enough that people can come and go without necessarily running into us every day, I said. We can also look again at the records to see if any of this equipment is unclaimed, I said. Yeah, that's true, Emmett said. Lena said thanks and stood to go. I watched her gray sedan pull out of the parking lot as I grabbed a quick lunch from the fridge because I had a general feeling of unease about the whole conversation that I could not quite define. I ate my turkey wrap and potato salad and went back out to my routes. I took a look around at my usual routes where a person might set up an unofficial camp, and everything seemed okay with the changing autumn leaves and the peacefulness of the late afternoon. The day ended sooner than I had anticipated. I reminded visitors that the park closed at dusk and watched as the wind carried leaves across the park's paths as the sun cooled to a gray hue that signaled the end of the season. I locked the main gate after the last car and reviewed the closing procedures with Emmett. I exited through the employee gate with little discussion since the day had been a long one, and Lena's visit lingered in my thoughts more than I cared to admit. I returned home and ate dinner in front of the TV, struggling to dismiss a sense that something had changed in the park that day. I attributed it to the end-of-season blues and retired early since I had to start the morning shift the following day. The next morning, a gray sky promised rain, and a bagel was purchased on the way to the park. I drove through quiet streets and rain that began to fall as I made my way to the front gate. As I slowed to a stop to unlock the gate, a figure was visible inside the chain-link fence that surrounded the park. It was turned away from the street and appeared to be looking at something deeper in the park. My stomach began to tighten as I realized that the gate had been locked the night before and no one should be inside. I pulled the truck over and called Carlton right away, letting him know that there was a person in the locked park. "I'm on my way with a cop," he said. "Just stay there." The person did not move as I sat there with my engine running loudly. His clothes had the appearance of being faded and ripped, as though he had been traveling for days without washing himself. It seemed like an eternity until Carlton and the cop pulled up behind me in the squad car. We got out and walked over towards the gate, matching each other's pace so that we would not know what we were walking into. It wasn't until we were close enough to get a good look at him that I saw the poster and knew who he was. It was Sam, and he was standing there with a flat expression on his face, as though we were just background and he had no idea why we were there. I dialed Lena while the cop was checking him over, and she said she'd be right there as quickly as she could. By then, the ambulance was there, so they began checking over Sam, and we all waited. When Lena arrived, she hugged me tightly, then went over to her brother. Sam was dehydrated, starving, but otherwise okay, although his eyes seemed to hold a depth of experience. They said it was a big trauma, but they didn't know what kind without further investigation. There were plenty of rangers and cops on hand, so we began a thorough search of the whole park, moving deliberately through each building and trail, since something seemed off from the moment we passed through the gate. There was a silence in the woods, a silence that was usually so peaceful, but now it was oppressive, heavy, and made the pine scent even stronger. I searched pavilions, bathrooms, storage sheds, and opened doors that should be locked, checking corners where nothing ever changed. Every shadow seemed to have the potential to conceal something. I looked over at Carlton, who seemed to share the same expression. The park, which had always felt like my own, felt wrong in some way, even if we could not quite say how. We searched the ponds, the picnic areas, the fire pits, finding everything in the same state as we had last seen it, exactly as it should be, with no signs of unauthorized entry or tampering. The question was how Sam had managed to get in without tripping the locks or the cameras, and it was one I thought about as I searched. I walked the outer loops once again, this time slower, my boots making crunching sounds in the wet gravel as the rain began to make the leaves slick. I stopped at every turn, looking into the underbrush because I could not shake the sense that I saw movement that stopped as soon as I looked directly at it. So we completed the sweep without any concrete evidence and headed back to the station for water. The park closed until further notice, and Sam to the hospital with Lena's family. "Something just feels off, I don't know what it is," Emmett said. And I agreed. The way Sam stood there staring at the park was etched in my mind. Carlton nodded, and we tried to analyze it further, but before we could even think about it further, Emmett stood up and moved around the room as if chasing a sound that only he could hear. He asked if we could feel the breeze, and indeed we could, a faint one that shouldn't be present in a closed room. One of the cops in the room gestured to a large file cabinet in the corner, and we all moved to it as Emmett and Carlton moved it away from the wall with a scraping sound that echoed in the silent room. Immediately, the air cooled and a portion of the floor lifted up slightly, revealing a dark hole leading down to a small cave below. Two of the cops in the room shone their flashlights down into it, and the others leaned in to take a peek, none of us knowing that it was even there despite our maintenance checks. The drop wasn't very deep, so we lowered ourselves down one by one. The cops went first, then Emmett, then Carlton, then me, because we had to investigate what was down below, although I was tempted to suggest we just go back up and pretend we never saw the cabinet in the first place. I swung my legs over the edge, and the cold, damp air greeted me as I lowered myself down into the cave. My boots scraped the rock floor, sending a few pebbles rolling. The space was smaller than it looked from the top, so I had to turn sideways in some places to follow the lights. The survey was empty. No footprints, no signs of anybody else being in here in a long time. Just the faint taste of metal in the air that made my throat constrict. We moved in a line, the cops sweeping their lights slowly across the smooth rock floor, which showed no signs of anybody else being here. We shone our lights across the space, hoping to find some clue as to how Sam got in, but there was nothing. Just plain old rock and the feeling that the space was only showing us what it felt like showing us. We were about to leave when we saw a small recessed wall a few feet back. The beam of the flashlight landed on the letters, which read, "We see you." The exclamation mark had extra loops, like the person who wrote it took their time with the writing, like they enjoyed it. A chill ran up my spine as I realized the paint was fresh, maybe only days or hours old. One of the cops took a picture with his phone and told us we didn't have to linger, so we all climbed back out in the same order, pushing the cabinet back in place. I dragged myself back up last, my arms burning, and glanced back over my shoulder into the darkness, still thinking about the message. Going back to the front room, the tension was palpable. The cop who took the picture told Carlton that the park should stay closed for the day, and Carlton agreed without argument because we all knew the tension in the air, like the building was holding its breath. We left a cop car at the gate overnight as a precaution. I drove home feeling like the park was safe, but as we were leaving, I saw something dark move behind a tree, but there was nothing there when I checked again. The cops never found any clues about how Sam got in or what happened to him during those missing weeks. It's all still a little fuzzy in the report, but I kept going to work because that's what I know how to do. I became more cautious after that. There were times when I was making my rounds that the hair on the back of my neck stood up and I'd look through the trees and across the trails, but there was never anyone there. One night, I thought I heard some steps near the ponds. I turned my flashlight through that area, and all I saw was ground and leaves. I stood there listening to that silence for a little while before moving on. After that, I made more of those outer loop patrols than I really had to. My flashlight cut through the mist from the ponds, and any little sound in the brush made me stop and wait for something to show itself. It never did, but the silence that followed got heavier and heavier each time, like the park was teaching me how to hold its breath before I broke. Little things began to add up, like equipment that I knew was left in one place was moved slightly, or a door that I was certain I closed properly was ajar in the morning. I reviewed all of the logs and cameras, but there was nothing. We sealed off the cave entrance under the cabinet as best we could, but I couldn't help wondering if there were more of those hidden areas in the park. The woods are old, and there is a lot of ground to hide in, especially for someone who knows how. I've worked in these parks for a long time, helping people, but now I find myself looking over my shoulder more than I used to, studying people who enter the park, wondering if they might be connected to whatever left that message. I am very tired, more so than my long hours at work, and I am writing this for a reason. I need to get it out before that tiredness sets in. I know that I think most people are good, that they come to this place for peace, but I know that this place now feels like it has secrets of its own. So should you visit one of these places and you get that feeling that something is off, even when everything appears normal, pay attention. What is lurking on the fringes may be closer than you think, and it may not be staying hidden. I continue to show up for my shifts, this is all I know, but I do so more cautiously now, and I do not walk these paths in the same manner. I'd been a park ranger for 5 months before I finally realized the night shift would require me to make my own rules if I was ever going to make it long enough to see the sun rise again. The handbook never once mentioned what it feels like when the woods are completely silent, when the only other living creature on the trails seems to know your name before you've ever even spoken it aloud. I thought the quiet was the best part of the job. The kind of quiet I'd spent my entire life searching for as a child, watching documentaries about the wilds of the world and how peaceful everything seemed to be. After the first week on the night shift, however, I began leaving a sheet of printer paper folded up in the bottom drawer of the desk at the information center, adding to it each time something came up that the last 2 rangers hadn't bothered to write down or perhaps wrote down, and the paper somehow vanished along with the last 2 men who'd worked the night shift. I continue to show up to work every night because the pay is steady and the park is small enough that most nights are routine. But I never go out on patrol without checking the paper first. And I never forget the last 2 men hadn't made it past their first 7 nights. The night that the East Quadrant patrol assignment fell to me began like any other night. I had gotten there 10 minutes early again, still hoping that my eagerness would make the long night ahead more bearable. The day shift ranger gave me the keys to the old patrol buggy and gave me the rundown on my assignment, mostly reminding me to keep an eye on the cameras and stay in the information center unless something suspicious turned up on the feeds. He did not mention the history of the night shift, and I did not ask him about it because I was still trying to prove myself capable of handling the quiet without getting nervous. The first 2 hours passed slowly in the information center, where only 2 late-night hikers stopped in to get maps of the trails. I spent my time staring at the grainy images coming in from the 4 quadrants of the park until the 2 hours ticked by and the clock struck the hour. I got up and took the flashlight and the keys and headed out into the east quadrant of the park because the random assignment had put me there, and I figured the undisturbed area would be the best way for me to pass the next hour without any trouble. I got into the buggy, which was pretty much an open-topped 4-wheel ATV with weak headlights and a radio that crackled more often than it worked. I took the winding road down into the trees while the crickets and the occasional owl's call filled the night air around me in a way that always made me feel like the whole park was alive and well. The sound started to die down about a mile in. I thought it was just my imagination or the sound of the engine covering it up at first, but the further in I went, the more silent it became until it was just the quiet whir of the tires on the dirt and my breathing, which I tried to keep quiet since the silence was so complete, as if the entire quadrant had decided to hold its breath at the same time. I kept the buggy at a slow crawl, the weak beams of the headlights crossing the trail as I went, since even though I liked the silence, I had learned in my training that silence in the woods meant something big was moving around you, and I didn't want to end up scaring a bear or a lost hiker. About halfway through the loop, I saw a figure in front of me, a bald man walking down the side of the path with his shoulders slumped and his legs moving awkwardly, as if he had been walking for days without a break. I stopped the buggy a good 30 yards back and kept the headlights trained straight on the man, since something about the way he froze in the beam of the headlights made my skin stand on end in a way that I couldn't explain at the time. I got the flashlight off the seat and stepped out, keeping the beam low and stable as I called out to the man, asking if he was okay and if he needed help since he looked like he was going to fall down at any second, and the park rules said that we were supposed to check on people who seemed lost or injured no matter what the hour was. He did not immediately respond. Instead, he simply stood there, his head down, so that the shadow of the headlights fell across his face, and I kept my distance, having dealt with enough drunk or high campers to know when a person was not tracking straight. When he did finally respond, it was slow and thick, like his tongue was too big for his mouth, and each word seemed to be forced, like it was having to fight its way out. He immediately called me Ranger, like he already knew who I was, and asked me if I was the new one on nights. Again, that same tight feeling in my gut, because I had not given him my name, and it was not a small enough park for every person to know every other person in the dark. I offered that I had protein bars in the buggy if he was hungry, and I asked him if he had been out there long, or if he needed a ride back to the main lot, because he did not look like a person who belonged on the trail at that hour of night, without a pack, without a light of his own. He kept saying he was only hungry and that it had been so long since he had a meal, and I turned to walk back to the buggy, planning to hand him the bars and radio for backup if he seemed worse up close. But that was when I sensed a change in the air behind me, the heavy breathing that was not my own, and the words that followed, low and close enough that I could feel the warmth of them against the back of my neck. He said it was my last mistake, and now he could eat. The impact hit me square between the shoulders like a sack of wet sand, slamming me forward and knocking the wind out of me so hard that my knees buckled, and I went down face first into the dirt, the flashlight still clutched in my right hand. I tried to push myself up, but his weight came down on my back, pinning me flat, and I heard this low guttural sound roll out of him, mixed in with the wet drip of something thick landing on my uniform shirt and soaking through to my skin. The fear hit me then, not the sharp kind that makes you scream, but the heavy dragging kind that makes every second stretch out as my mind raced through every stupid choice that had led me to this exact spot on an empty trail in the middle of the night. I twisted hard under him, swinging the flashlight in a wild arc, and the butt end connected with something solid enough to make him grunt and shift his weight just enough that I could scramble forward on my elbows and knees toward the buggy. When I finally got a clear look at him in the headlights, his face was still in shadow, but his mouth hung open in this slack, unnatural way, and he stayed perfectly still the second my eyes locked on him again. That stillness was worse than any movement because it felt deliberate, like he was waiting for me to blink so he could close the distance without me seeing it happen. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off his face, because something in my gut was telling me the second I took my eyes off him, he would be on me again. I continued to speak to him in this calm voice that wasn't really coming from anywhere in my brain, telling him to stay right there, to stay right where he was while I went to get his food, like nothing in the past 30 seconds had happened. He didn't move, and I was able to reach the door to the buggy and climb inside with my eyes locked on his face, not taking them away for even a second. I fumbled the key into the ignition with my other hand, my heart pounding in my chest so loudly that I could hear it over the roar of the engine catching. The engine roared to life, and I put it in gear, swinging the tires wide to get past him. My eyes locked on the rearview mirror as long as I could as I took off down the path, because he was standing in the same place where I had left him, his eyes locked on my face, his low, grinding laugh echoing through the trees as I drove away from him. I completed the remainder of the circuit in quicker time than I should have, taking the corners too sharply and feeling the buggy rock on the uneven terrain, but I did not ease off until I could see the lights of the information center. Even then, I was still checking the mirrors all the way, as the silence was back, thicker than ever, and I could still feel the weight of him on my back like a memory that would not go away. I put the buggy in a crooked position in front of the center and just sat there for a long minute with the engine running and the doors locked, trying to catch my breath and figure out what had just happened. He had known I was the new ranger, and he talked about meals and last mistakes in a way that made my skin crawl even more now that I was safely inside the well-lit building. I went straight to the desk, got a fresh sheet of printer paper and started writing since I was not going to quit, but I also was not going to survive another night like that without something to remind me what to watch for. I wrote the first rule at the top in big block letters. Never break line of sight with the bald man on the East Trail. If you do, then pray he decides he is not hungry enough to finish what he started. I underlined it twice since the way he stood so still when I stared at him was more important than anything I learned in my training. I just sat there for the rest of the shift, jumping at every creak in the building and staring at the monitors, even though the east quadrant stayed dark and empty on the screen. I kept adding little notes to the paper about the way the silence falls and the way the man knows your schedule before you do, since I figured the next guy on nights would at least deserve that much warning. The days that followed that one all kind of run together as I showed up to every shift and dug through the old records looking for any mention of any of the old rangers who had worked at night. There were little pieces of information scattered throughout the old incident reports detailing guys who had called in strange occurrences or just stopped responding to radio calls, and it all fit a little too well with what the man had told me about the last ranger. More rules came to be added over the coming weeks, things like never stop the buggy if it sounds too quiet on the trail, and always keep a second flashlight attached to your belt in case one gets knocked loose. And I made sure to keep that paper hidden in the drawer because I didn't want the day shift asking questions that I couldn't really answer without looking like a crazy person. The dread built up slowly after that first encounter, not a dread that keeps you awake all day, but a slow-building dread that makes every shadow on the trail feel a little heavier and every quiet moment feel like it's waiting for something to happen. I still draw to that east quadrant when it is my turn because I need to know if he is still out there, and I still keep my eyes glued to anything that moves, even if it is only leaves blowing in the wind, because I have seen what can happen if you look away for even a second. I have learned in the last 5 months that the park doesn't care about the rules, and the night shift is whoever decides to hike the trails when the rest of the world is asleep. I continue to show up because if I quit, it would mean admitting that the man on the East Trail has already won. I'm tired in a way that feels like it sits in my bones, and I continue to read the paper every single night before I head out to my patrol because I still believe I can make it through the next night if I just follow the rules I have made for myself. The woods are still pretty in the daytime, and the visitors still smile when they ask for directions. But I know what is lurking in the woods after dark, and I know it is watching for the new guy who has not yet learned that sometimes the patrol ends with you writing notes for the ranger who comes after you. So if ever in the future you find yourself on the night shift in a park such as this one, and the quiet falls around you like a blanket that is too heavy to bear, just keep your eyes forward and keep walking because breaking line of sight might just be the last mistake you ever get to make, and the woods have a way of remembering who looked away first. I am writing this now because I need it out of my head before my next patrol, and I still want to believe that most people who come here just want to enjoy the peace and quiet, but I have seen what the quiet can hide when it gets hungry. I was already on the third landing of the stairs when the first real gust of wind slammed into the tower, hard enough to make the whole structure sway under my boots. I gripped the railing tighter because the rain had started coming down in sheets that made every step feel slick and uncertain, and I kept telling myself the climb was the same as it always was, even though the dark below had swallowed the ground completely, and the only thing guiding me was the weak beam of my flashlight cutting through the drops. I had drawn the sentinel shift again because I was still the newest on the crew, and the older rangers had their poker game locked in for the night, and none of them wanted to trade. So I was the one heading up there alone, with my bag slung over my shoulder and the radio clipped to my belt crackling every few minutes with the usual check-ins from the station. But the static was already getting worse with the storm moving in fast. The tower had always been my least favorite spot on night duty, because once you got past the first 30 feet, the world dropped away and you were just this small lit box floating above the trees with nothing but the wind and your own thoughts for company. After the year I had scraped through, with school grinding me down and the breakup leaving me raw, I'd thought the park would be the escape I needed. But nights like this made me wonder if I had traded one kind of pressure for another that felt heavier because it came without anyone around to talk it through. I kept climbing because that was the job, and I had already radioed down that I was on my way up. Jonesy had come back saying the woman who had walked into the station earlier was still there, telling her story about something following her on the Sandalwood Loop, and he wanted me to hear the details before I got too high, because the signal might cut out once the storm really hit. I paused on the next landing to catch my breath and swept the flashlight beam down the stairs behind me, because the way the wood creaked under my weight felt different tonight, like the tower was shifting more than usual, and the rain was already soaking through my jacket and making my socks squelch inside my boots. The climb took longer than the usual 10 minutes because I was taking each step carefully, and I kept stopping to listen, because the woman's report had stuck in my head even though I had only caught the tail end of it when I walked into the station. She had described the shape slipping between the trees, staying just off the trail and making these low, chittering sounds that did not match any animal she knew, and then the whistle that sounded too much like a wood thrush for the time of night. I reached the top landing finally, unlocked the cabin door with the key on my ring, and stepped inside, where the single bare bulb overhead flickered once before it steadied. I dropped my bag on the old desk and sat down in the insulated chair that faced the big window, because the job was to scan the horizon for fires or anything out of place. On a night like this, with the clouds thick and the moon hidden, I knew the forest below was nothing but a black mass with no lights showing anywhere, and the rain was already hammering the roof in a steady rhythm that made the whole cabin feel smaller. I radioed down to let them know I was set, and Jonesy came back saying the sweep of the Sandalwood Loop had turned up nothing but wet leaves and mud, and the two guys were heading out on their pass around the park to check the rest of the trails. I set the radio down on the desk and tried to open the book I had brought, but the words wouldn't stick because the woman's story kept looping in my head and the tower kept shifting with every gust like it was breathing in time with me. After a while, I stood up, walked to the big window, and pressed my forehead against the glass. The rain was coming down harder now, and the lightning flashes inside the clouds lit up patches of the treetops in brief white bursts that made the forest look alive in a way that felt wrong. I told myself I was just tired from the long day, but the creak I heard then from the landing outside the door was not the wind. It was too deliberate and too close, and I froze with my hand still on the glass, because I knew every sound the tower made after all these nights, and this one did not belong. I waited a long minute, holding my breath, and when nothing else came, I walked to the door and opened it slowly. I stepped out onto the landing with the rain hitting my face, cold and steady, and I looked down the stairs, where the beam from my flashlight only reached the next landing before the dark swallowed everything else. I swept the light across the railing, and that was when I saw the second set of eyes carved into the wood 2 flights down, with the cuts looking fresh enough that the rain had not washed away the shavings yet. My stomach dropped because I had checked the stairs on the way up, and nothing had been there then. I backed into the cabin and closed the door, leaning against it for a second while the rain drummed harder on the roof. I tried to tell myself it was kids from earlier, or one of the guys playing a joke, but the woman's description of the shape hiding behind trees kept pushing its way in, and I knew I had to check the stairs again because waiting in the cabin with the door closed would only make the dread worse. I grabbed the radio, even though it had been giving static off and on with the storm, stepped back out, and started down the first flight, keeping my steps quiet on the wet wood because I didn't want to give away where I was if someone was really down there. The rain made everything slick, so I kept one hand on the railing and the other on the flashlight, even though I kept it off most of the time to save the battery and to stay hidden. I reached the landing where I had seen the carving and ran my fingers over the eyes. The cuts were deep and deliberate, and the way they stared straight up the stairs made my skin crawl because it felt like they had been waiting for me specifically. I heard the creak again from below, this time followed by the low whistle that sounded exactly like the wood thrush the woman had described, and I knew it was not a bird because the storm had silenced everything else. I backed up a step and heard movement on the stairs farther down, and then the chittering sound came from above me near the cabin. I realized there were 2 of them now, one coming from the ground and one already on the upper levels, and the tower that had always been my quiet escape now felt like a trap with no way out except the long drop. I climbed over the railing on that landing because my mind had already raced ahead to the only option that did not end with me cornered. I hung off the side, with my hands gripping the wet pine and my bare feet searching for the railing below, because I had kicked off my boots earlier to move quieter. The rain made my palms slick, so I dug my nails into the wood to hold on while the footsteps from above reached the landing I had just left. The chittering came again, low and close, and then the wood thrush whistle answered from below. I held my breath while the man from above started down the stairs right past me, and I felt the vibration of his steps through the railing as he moved slow and deliberate, like he was hunting something that had already slipped away. My arms burned after the first minute, and the rain ran into my eyes, making everything blur, but I stayed perfectly still because I knew if I moved even an inch, they would hear it. I waited until the footsteps passed the next landing, and I heard the thud of my boot that I had dropped earlier to draw them down. Then I pulled myself up with everything I had left, my shoulders screaming as I swung my leg over the railing. I got back onto the landing and ran up the stairs toward the cabin, because the second set of footsteps was already turning around below me and coming fast now that they knew I was not where they thought. I reached the top landing and saw the third set of eyes carved right above the cabin door, with the message scratched underneath asking who was watching me. I shoved the door open and leaned my full weight against it from the inside while the rain hammered the roof and the thunder rolled close enough to shake the whole tower. The door thumped against my back once, twice, 3 times, and I felt it give a little each time. My socks slid on the wet floor, but I kept pushing because I could hear both of them on the landing now, breathing hard and chittering to each other like they were coordinating the next move, and I yelled because the fear had finally broken loose and I could not hold it in any longer. The door kept thumping, and I felt it inch open wider. I knew I was losing, but I kept my back braced while I looked around the cabin for anything that could help, and my eyes landed on the insulated stool with the glass legs. I remembered how the lightning had been flashing closer and closer, so I lunged for it just as the door burst open behind me. I sat down hard on the stool and lifted my feet off the floor, holding on while the 2 men came through the doorway with their eyes locked on me and the knife in one of their hands catching the light from the bulb overhead. The thunder cracked right then, like the sky was splitting open, and the lightning hit the tower with a sound that filled the whole cabin with white. I felt the charge run through the air, but the glass kept me safe while the men stood in the puddle that had formed on the floor. The blast threw them back out the door and over the railing, and I heard them fall the long way down while the tower shook and the fire started licking at the pine around me. I sat there for a long second with my ears ringing and my hands still gripping the stool. Then I got up and ran out the door and down the stairs, because the flames were spreading fast and I could feel the heat on my back as I took the steps 2 at a time, my bare feet slipping on the wet wood and the smoke already starting to sting my eyes. The wind whipped the fire higher with every gust, and the creaks of the tower turned into groans as the wood started to give way under the heat. I reached the bottom landing in what felt like no time at all and collapsed on the ground just as the gator carts pulled up, their headlights cutting through the rain. Jonesy and the others jumped out and ran over to me while the tower burned above us, lighting up the whole forest in orange and black. The flames crackled loud enough to drown out the thunder, and the rain kept coming down like it was trying to put the fire out, but the pine was old and dry underneath, and the blaze kept spreading up the stilts 1 level at a time. I told them what had happened in pieces between breaths because my voice wouldn't work right and the words kept catching in my throat. They got me into one of the carts and drove me back to the station while the fire crews arrived, and the tower kept burning for over an hour until there was nothing left but the stilts and the smell of wet smoke and scorched pine that clung to everything. The rain finally started to ease off as the storm moved past. They found the 2 men at the base the next morning, and the police told me later that they were escaped convicts from the facility a few miles away who had been on the run for 3 days. They had been looking for a place to hide, and I had been in the wrong spot at the wrong time. The way they had moved through the trees and up the tower showed they had been watching the park long enough to know the routines and the shift schedules and the quiet hours when the Sentinel would be the only lit spot for miles. I sat in the station with a blanket around my shoulders and my feet wrapped in gauze, and listened while they explained how the men had probably watched me climb the tower and decided I was an easy target, and how one of them had climbed onto the roof of the cabin to wait for the right moment, while the other stayed below to cut off any escape. I nodded because it made sense in a way that left me cold and empty. I told them about the carved eyes and the whistles and the chittering, and they took notes. But I could tell they were already thinking about how to close the case without scaring off the visitors who still came to the park looking for the same peace I had once believed in. I finished my last few weeks on day shifts only because no one wanted me back in the tower, and the park paid me out for the remaining time because they understood that some things stay with you longer than the paycheck. I turned in my badge the day before I went back to school, because the quiet I had come looking for had turned into something I could not unhear. I still check over my shoulder when I walk alone at night, even though I am miles away from that park now, and the woods near my new place feel different in a way I cannot explain. I kept the small piece of burned pine I took from the base of the tower because I needed something solid to remind me that I had made it down those stairs. I still look at it when the nights get too quiet and remember how it felt to hang off the side of that landing with the rain in my face and the footsteps passing inches away, and the chittering sound echoing in the dark like it was laughing at how close it had come. I was supposed to be the one watching the forest, but that night the forest watched me back. I learned that some jobs change you in ways you cannot put back together, no matter how many books you read, or how many shifts you finish, or how many times you tell yourself it was just the storm and the dark playing tricks. The carvings stayed with me, and the whistles stayed with me, and the feeling of hanging there with my arms burning and the rain blinding me stayed with me long after the tower was gone and the police closed the file. I still love the outdoors, and I still take walks in the woods when I can. But I never go out after dark anymore, and I never climb anything taller than I have to, because I know what it feels like when the only way down is the long way, and someone else is already waiting at the bottom with eyes carved into the wood and a whistle that sounds too much like a bird that should not be singing, and the knowledge that they had been watching the whole time from the trees and from the roof and from the stairs. I am tired now in a way that sits deeper than the long nights. And I am writing this because I need to get it out before it settles in for good, and because I still believe most people who go to parks just want the peace. But I know the peace can hide things that do not want to be seen, and sometimes the things watching from the edges are closer than you think, and they do not always stay hidden. I keep the piece of pine on my desk and look at it every morning. I remember that I got out, but I also remember that for a few minutes up there, I was the one being watched, and the feeling has not left me since, and it probably never will. The days after the fire blurred together, with me showing up for my remaining shifts on the ground level only, because the tower was gone and the park had put up temporary barriers around the burned stilts. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air whenever the wind shifted. I spent most of my time clearing the trails that had been closed because of the storm damage and checking the campgrounds for any signs of squatters or drifters, because the incident had made everyone a little more cautious, and the older rangers kept glancing at me like they expected me to break down any minute. I kept my head down and did the work because quitting right then would have felt like letting the men win, even though they were already gone. I thought about the climb down that night more than I wanted to, because every time I closed my eyes I could feel the wet wood under my bare feet, the way my nails had dug into the pine to keep my grip, and the sound of the footsteps passing so close that I could have reached out and touched the leg of the one above me if I'd wanted to, and the chittering that had followed me down the stairs like it was mocking how close I had come to not making it. I added more details to the report when the police came back for a follow-up, because they wanted to know every sound I had heard and every carving I had seen. I described the eyes again and the message above the cabin door, and the way the knife had caught the light just before the lightning hit. They nodded and wrote it all down, but I could see in their faces that they were already filing it under escaped convicts with bad luck, and I did not argue because I knew what I had lived through, and I knew the tower had been watching me back long before the men ever reached the stairs. I finished out my time at the park with a piece of burned pine in my pocket, because I needed to carry it with me as a reminder that I had survived something that could have ended much worse. I still pulled it out during the quiet moments on the trails when the wind picked up and the trees creaked in a way that sounded too familiar, and I would run my thumb over the charred edge and remember the heat on my back as I ran down the stairs and the way the fire had lit up the forest like a beacon calling the crews in. The park gave me a small payout for the remaining weeks, and they understood when I said I needed to head back to school early because the nights had started feeling too long and the quiet too heavy. I packed my things and drove away from the entrance gate one last time, with the smell of smoke still in my clothes and the image of the carved eyes burned into my memory like the lightning had etched them there permanently. I went back to my classes and tried to focus on the lectures and the assignments, but the tower kept creeping into my thoughts during the late study sessions. I would catch myself staring out the window at the dark campus paths, wondering if the shapes I saw moving between the buildings were real or just the memory playing tricks, and I started taking the longer route to my dorm because the shorter one went through a wooded section that felt too much like the trails I had left behind. I kept the piece of pine on my desk in my new apartment and looked at it every morning when I woke up and every night before I tried to sleep, because it grounded me in the fact that I had made it down those stairs and had survived the men who had climbed after me, and I had lived through the lightning strike that had saved me when nothing else could. The feeling of being watched had not left me, but it had changed into something I could carry instead of something that carried me. I still love the outdoors and I still take walks in the woods when I can, but I never go out after dark anymore, and I never climb anything taller than I have to, because I know what it feels like when the only way down is the long way and someone else is already waiting at the bottom with eyes carved into the wood and a whistle that sounds too much like a bird that should not be singing, and the knowledge that they had been watching the whole time from the trees and from the roof and from the stairs. I am tired now in a way that sits deeper than the long nights, and I am writing this because I need to get it out before it settles in for good, and because I still believe most people who go to parks just want the peace. But I know the peace can hide things that do not want to be seen, and sometimes the things watching from the edges are closer than you think, and they do not always stay hidden. I keep the piece of pine on my desk and look at it every morning. I remember that I got out, but I also remember that for a few minutes up there, I was the one being watched, and the feeling has not left me since, and it probably never will. The weeks after I left the park were filled with the kind of normal that felt strange after everything that had happened. I went back to my classes and sat in lecture halls with hundreds of other students and tried to focus on the material, but my mind kept drifting back to the tower. The way the wind had made the cabin shift, the way the rain had made the stairs slick, and the way the carvings had appeared on the railings like they had been waiting for me to find them one by one. I would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes with the sound of the chittering still echoing in my head, and I would sit up in bed, turn on the light, and stare at the piece of pine on my desk until the memory faded enough for me to try to sleep again. I started keeping a notebook by the bed so I could write down the details when they came, because writing them out made them feel less like they were still happening and more like they were something I had lived through and survived. I talked to a counselor on campus about it once because the dreams were getting worse and the feeling of being watched followed me even in the daylight when I walked across the quad or sat in the library. She listened and nodded and suggested techniques for grounding myself, but I knew the only thing that really helped was the piece of pine, because it was real and it was from that night, and it proved that I had made it down the stairs, and the lightning had done what nothing else could. I finished the semester and moved into a new apartment closer to campus. I kept the piece of pine on the windowsill where I could see it every time I looked outside, and I started taking longer walks during the day in the small park near my building. The trees there were shorter and the paths were paved, and the open sky made the space feel less like the forest I had left behind. I would sit on a bench and watch the people walking their dogs or pushing strollers, and I would remind myself that most days in the park were just normal days with normal people, and the things that had happened in the Sentinel were an exception, not the rule. I still checked over my shoulder more than I needed to, and I still avoided the wooded sections after dusk, and I still woke up some nights with the sound of the whistle in my ears. But the piece of pine was always there, and it helped me remember that I had survived, that the men were gone, the tower was gone, and the only things left were the memory and the feeling that had changed me in ways I was still learning to live with. I am tired now in a way that sits deeper than the long nights, and I am writing this because I need to get it out before it settles in for good, and because I still believe most people who go to parks just want the peace. But I know the peace can hide things that do not want to be seen, and sometimes the things watching from the edges are closer than you think, and they do not always stay hidden. I keep the piece of pine on my desk and look at it every morning. I remember that I got out, but I also remember that for a few minutes up there I was the one being watched, and the feeling has not left me since, and it probably never will. The end of the semester came, and I packed up my things and drove home for the break. I kept the piece of pine in the cup holder of my car because I did not want to leave it behind, and I listened to the radio the whole way because the silence in the car felt too much like the silence in the tower. I stopped at a rest area once to stretch my legs and stood in the parking lot looking at the trees that lined the highway, wondering if any of them hid shapes that watched the people coming and going. I shook the thought off because I knew I was letting the memory get the better of me, but the feeling stayed with me for the rest of the drive. I got home, unpacked, and put the piece of pine on the shelf in my old room. I tried to settle back into the routine of family dinners and catching up with friends, but the stories they told about their summers felt small compared to what I had lived through, and I kept my own story to myself because I did not want to explain the carvings or the whistles or the way I had hung off the side of the tower with my arms burning and the rain blinding me and the footsteps passing so close. I went for walks in the local park during the day because the paths were familiar and the trees were the same ones I had grown up with. But even there, I found myself scanning the underbrush for movement that did not belong. I would catch myself stopping to listen for the chittering or the whistle, and I would force myself to keep moving because I knew the park there was safe and the things that had happened in the Sentinel were far away. But the feeling followed me anyway. I went back to school for the next semester and took on more classes to keep my mind busy. I joined a study group so I would not be alone in the library at night, and I started running on the campus track during the day because the open space and the other people made the quiet feel less heavy. I kept the piece of pine in my backpack because I needed it close, even if I did not look at it every hour. The dreams came less often after a while, but when they did, they were the same. I would be climbing the stairs and the carvings would appear on every landing and the footsteps would follow me, and I would wake up with my heart pounding. I would turn on the light and look at the piece of pine and remind myself that I had made it down, the lightning had saved me, and the men were gone. I finished the year and graduated, then moved to a new city for a job that had nothing to do with parks or towers or forests. I kept the piece of pine on my new desk and looked at it every morning when I woke up and every night before I tried to sleep, and I started to feel like the memory was something I could carry without it carrying me. I still love the outdoors and I still take walks in the woods when I can, but I never go out after dark anymore, and I never climb anything taller than I have to, because I know what it feels like when the only way down is the long way and someone else is already waiting at the bottom with eyes carved into the wood and a whistle that sounds too much like a bird that should not be singing, and the knowledge that they had been watching the whole time from the trees and from the roof and from the stairs. I am tired now in a way that sits deeper than the long nights, and I am writing this because I need to get it out before it settles in for good, and because I still believe most people who go to parks just want the peace. But I know the peace can hide things that do not want to be seen, and sometimes the things watching from the edges are closer than you think, and they do not always stay hidden. I keep the piece of pine on my desk and look at it every morning. I remember that I got out, but I also remember that for a few minutes up there, I was the one being watched, and the feeling has not left me since, and it probably never will. The years have passed since that night in the Sentinel, and I have built a life that feels steady and normal, with a job I like and friends I see regularly, and a routine that keeps the quiet from getting too loud. But the piece of pine is still on my desk, and I still look at it every day, and I still think about the tower and the carvings, and the way the lightning saved me when nothing else could. I still feel the weight of being watched, even though I know the men are gone and the tower is gone and the park has moved on. I have gone back to the park once since then for a visit because I needed to see the spot where the stilt still stood like a skeleton against the trees. I stood at the base and looked up at the empty space where the cabin had been, and I felt the same pull in my gut that I had felt that night. I touched the piece of pine in my pocket and remembered that I had survived, that I had made it down the stairs, that I had lived through the fire and the fall and the fear. I walked the sandalwood loop that day in the daylight and stopped at the bend where the woman had seen the shape. I looked into the trees and saw nothing but leaves and light, and I told myself the park was safe again. But the feeling stayed with me as I walked back to my car and drove away, knowing that some things leave marks that do not fade no matter how much time passes. I am tired now in a way that sits deeper than the long nights, and I am writing this because I need to get it out before it settles in for good, and because I still believe most people who go to parks just want the peace, but I know the peace can hide things that do not want to be seen. And sometimes the things watching from the edges are closer than you think, and they do not always stay hidden. I keep the piece of pine on my desk and look at it every morning. I remember that I got out, but I also remember that for a few minutes up there I was the one being watched, and the feeling has not left me since, and it probably never will.